All right, let's talk a little bit about chapter 1 in the textbook. I apologize for the yellow font on this slide. I'll try to fix that in the future. It looks kind of crummy on the screen. So, our learning objectives. We need to talk about the consequences of ionization on human cells, just generally. We need to talk about examples of safe use of radiation. Discuss the needs for using radiation safely, and explain justification responsibility. Discuss ALARA and BERT, which if you're not familiar with those terms, you probably are familiar with ALARA, but maybe not BERT. And then we'll define the sievert. So, how has radiation rolled out in medicine? Well, we had the discovery of X-ray in 1895 by William Conrad Röntgen. Although Tesla claimed that he had discovered it prior to that while he was hanging out with his girlfriend. He didn't, he was too busy to write it down though. So we do credit it to Röntgen. He's the first person to receive a Nobel Prize in physics. There was an increased awareness of the values of X-rays in the medical community as a diagnostic tool almost immediately after that. So within a year of Röntgen's discovery, we have the first medical X-ray being taken in, I believe, in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College. A young man broke his arm on a skating rink. And then we discovered radioactivity, which is what this little guy right here is doing. It's ticking off radioactivity. So in this room right now, there's naturally occurring radiation coming either from the walls or from possibly those windows, or cosmic radiation from the sun. But it's so tremendously powerful, it passed through this building, through the planet itself, and went on to exit the planet and continue on into outer space. So some of the radiation that we're dealing with is incredibly powerful. So this thing just has an ionization chamber in it. Anything that strikes the gas inside of the ionization chamber causing ionization causes it to release, the gas to release an electron, and that the positively charged ion is what's being picked up by this little counter here, right? So we need to understand that there is both a beneficial and destructive potential with radiation. So initially, all people understood about radiation is that they believed it was tremendously beneficial. It was discovered during the end of the Victorian period, where there was a belief that science would ultimately liberate all mankind. That was prior to World War I and then World War II, right? By the time that the two world wars were done, we pretty much understood that science could possibly cause the liberation of all mankind or annihilate us all, right? Because World War II ends with the dropping of two nuclear bombs on the island of Japan, as the movie History of Japan by Bill Wirtz clearly demonstrates. And it was a tremendous event that radically changed the history of life on this planet. It also changed people's attitudes about radiation. Radiation went from being something that was completely beneficial and helpful to something that was scary and the cause of monsters like Godzilla, right? So the popular social response to radiation was essentially this: that's crazy, let the government handle it, right? So the government went on to handle it by doing a whole lot of atomic bombs tests, because that's what happens if you let governments handle radiation. They do a lot of atomic bombs tests. It's like the 4th of July or something. We're at this point in history now where we recognize both that there's benefits and destructive potentials in radiation, right? And so we're going to be talking about that as it affected the history of this. And I'm just trying to give us some general context around this so that we understand why we're sitting in this classroom now. Now, with the continuing research into the effects of the radiation that occurred with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, as well as radiation that resulted from the use of nuclear weapons testing, as well as the use of radiation in medicine, as well as nuclear power plant incidents like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, we started to develop a body of knowledge around radiation, a scientific body of knowledge. Now, it would be completely bogus for me to act that like all of that scientific knowledge was the result of ethical research. Hear me say this. not everything that we know about radiation's potential to cause harm was gained ethically. There's a good amount of it that was gained by Nazi scientists experimenting on Jews and homosexuals and communists. There's a little good amount of it that was resulted from the U.S. government experimenting on people in rural Appalachia. There's a good amount of it that resulted on the U.S. military experimenting on people in the islands of the South Pacific. So not all of this information was ethically acquired. I'll let that settle for a second. I'll bring in, at a later date, a book released by the Clinton administration called The Human Radiation Experiments that details all of the government-funded research into the effects of radioactivity that was conducted on U.S. citizens without them knowing it. It included things like injecting people with radioisotopes, having orphans eat things that were laced with radioisotopes. It's pretty scary stuff, right? Which brings us to where we're at right now. That in the past, we had this attitude of like, well, that's crazy, that's big, let the government handle it, right? And the attitude trickled down into the field of technology and therapy, radiation therapy, of just like, basically, the doctor knows, trust the doctor, right? Now, the shift is more towards being able to use this stuff in a way that I would call patient-centered. Patient-centered, which means that we need to educate ourselves on what we're doing so that we can involve the patient in the process, right? So some of the challenge that I have for you is to view yourselves as educators, to view yourselves as teachers who are trying to talk about this stuff in a way that's not excluding it from the patient's quality world, right? It's hard to think about things as a teacher, because as a teacher, you've got to break it down. You've got to bring it down to its most essential level in order to build someone's knowledge up. And that's tricky, but I know that y'all can do it. So what are X-rays? What are X-rays? Well, to say that they're a form of ionizing radiation doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it tells us something, and it's important. They exist on the electromagnetic spectrum, and they exhibit behaviors that are somewhat like a wave and somewhat like a particle. So sometimes we refer to them as a photon. I may call it an X-ray, I may call it a photon. Any one of those things is appropriate. It's also something like an invisible light wave. So it has properties similar to light, but then also has some properties that are nothing like light. Like, for example, light is capable of being refracted. Initially, we thought that X-rays were not refracted, but then we learned that they could possibly be refracted. It was just a very different process. So ionizing radiation is generally thought about as its effect, something that causes this particular ionizing effect. Ionization means that an electron has been liberated from an otherwise stable atom, probably. So an atom within your body, a photon strikes that atom, it liberates an electron, and what results, the result of that interaction, we call an ion pair. There is now a negatively charged, there's two particles that have polar opposite charges. We have an electron with a net negative charge, and we have an atom that has a net positive charge. A net positive charge. So we call that an ionization pair. If we produce a whole lot of ions inside of organic material, it causes biological change. Normal biology is interrupted at the cellular level, at the tissue level, at the organ level, and even if we zoom down closer, potentially even at the level of the DNA. So we can change biological processes in a fundamental way through this ionization event. Now, one thing that's not on this slide that's really, really important is the last part of how we define an X-ray is where did it come from? Its source. So we will talk more about source next week, but this thing is beeping not because of X-rays. An X-ray machine A linear accelerator works a lot like a light switch. I turn it on and it's making x-rays. I turn it off, it's not. It's as simple as that. So the source is completely artificial. We bombard an anode with electrons, it produces x-rays. That's what we call what results from that, right? Heat and x-rays. The source that's causing this thing to beep is not an x-ray, in other words, right? What's causing this thing to beep is something that's naturally occurring, and it's always emitting radiation. I can't turn it on or off, right? And it is this radioactive source inside of this thing, as well as the cosmic rays that I mentioned earlier. So I'll bring this thing out now. I've got it inside of a Ziploc bag just because I'm a nerd, but I found this in an antique mall in Millington, right? It's got a Lucky Strike cigarette and some matches and this uranium glass ashtray. So listen real quickly. So as the uranium in the glass decays, it's emitting gamma rays. They're a lot like X-rays. They're a lot like X-rays. If we look at them, if we looked at the two flying through space somehow, they would look identical. They're both electromagnetic radiation. They both cause ionization. How do they differ then? How do they differ?
Gamma waves are shorter.
Gamma rays generally are more powerful, right? And one thing that's interesting about gamma rays is if I had a special device in here that told me precisely what the energy of the gamma ray is, I could tell you exactly what that source is, right? So they differ because of their source. The gamma ray's source is a nuclear decay process. Something decays, it gives off gamma rays, it gives off beta particles, it gives off alpha particles, etc., etc. This is decaying and giving off gamma rays as well as probably some kind of alpha particle, right? When a radioactive source decays, what we have is something short of black magic occurring at that moment. It is literally changing its element. It's changing its place on the periodic table. What I'm saying is we have the power to take one element and turn it into gold through radioactive processes. The problem is that element would have to be platinum, right? If platinum was radioactive, it would decay and turn into gold. The gold would continue to be radioactive, and so it would further decay and turn into lead. It's a profound thing that we don't fully understand how it works, but that's part of what we're unpacking here. So I'll put this thing back up. Interestingly enough, tobacco is also radioactive because it has an affinity for polonium. So it's like a giant polonium sponge. It just sucks up, the plant just sucks up this radioactive material. Another example of something that's radioactive like tobacco is a banana. Bananas really like potassium, right? So K40, I think, is what it is. Radioactive isotope that's there in bananas. Every time you're eating a banana, you're getting a small dose of radiation. Internal dose. So what would happen if we eat that radioactive banana all day long, right? In fact, the military has used bananas as a way of explaining to troops what their radiation dose was. Today we got 40 tons of bananas. Because it's understandable. They could equate it to a certain amount, and they could make it relatable to troops. But what are the consequences of getting that 40 tons of bananas, right? Well, here it is broken down step by step. So it creates unstable atoms and free electrons. If those electrons are high speed, that's a problem, because high speed electrons can do a lot. It can produce other low energy photons. In fact, if the patient is a CT patient and they have iodine contrast on board, we just increase the radiation dose, because all that heavy metal iodine just produced that much more radiation inside of their body. And we'll talk more about that as we progress. It can create reactive free radicals. So we're all trying to eat antioxidants and stuff all the time. Why? Because they reduce the amount of free radicals in the body. Radiation's a really good way to increase the number of free radicals in your body. If you're someone who asks for more MSG at the Chinese restaurant, you can also ask for more x-rays next time you go to the doctor, and increase the free radical production inside of your body. These free radicals can produce substances that are actually destructive to organic material. Things like hydrogen peroxide. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily want hydrogen peroxide floating around inside my body. All right. It can create new biological molecules that are detrimental to the living cell. And we can also create cells that are essentially mutated. Now, we've learned through the application of radiation and through the study of its use, we're not talking about literally making Godzilla. We still have patients who will make those awful jokes, though, right? So be prepared for them. What they're referring to is their limited understanding of radiation resulted in a fear of mutation. And that fear is still very much with us today, right? It is a real fear, and it's something that we kind of have to face down as x-ray techs, as therapists, as nuclear medicine technologists, because if we don't face it down, if we do not understand this material well, hear me, you will become nihilistic in your stance towards your job. Your job will become meaningless if you do not understand what I'm saying. You will start to just look at the people that you're x-raying and just kind of have an attitude of shoot them all and let God sort them out, right? One attitude that it was a common saying at a radiation therapy clinic that I worked at, is just like, who cares if you have to repeat the CT scan? We're about to hit them with a whole bunch of radiation from the linear accelerator. Just give them more, you know. So those types of attitudes are there. They're part of working in the profession, and they largely come from fear, superstitious fear, right, based on our understanding of cellular mutation and the irreparable changes that can happen as a result of exposure to ionizing radiation. One thing I want to stress, though, and ask you is this question. So radiation has been present on the Earth since when? Its beginning, the 14th century, the 18th century, or the 20th century? Good. The beginning of life on the planet. So from the inception of life, whether that happened through God creating things, physically actually speaking them into existence, or causing natural processes to occur that resulted in life to take root on this world, regardless, radiation was there. So the next question is, well, how do we use it safely then? Because we've discovered that the cat's out of the bag. We can't put it back. We're either going to figure out how to live with this thing or it's going to destroy us, right? That's really the only options here. So here's some helpful steps. Have knowledge, particularly of the hazards. And there's a lot of knowledge that we've gained over the years. I'm going to try to condense a lot of that knowledge down into this class. Use effective methods to eliminate those hazards. It might seem completely obvious, but when people are freaking out and their pants are on fire with radioactive flames, you may not be thinking about how to interact with that safely, right? So it requires training, it requires discipline, it requires some repeated simulation and in controlled environments in order to respond appropriately. Another part to this that's kind of buried in this is recognize who on your team is best equipped to handle a hazard, right? If it's a hazard involving the x-ray machine, that's me. If it's a hazard involving radioactive blood, I'm probably not going to handle that, right? But it doesn't need to be housekeeping that handles it either. So I need to understand who needs to handle what and how to use the equipment that allows me to make those decisions pretty quickly. So we want to be able to control radiation production, whether that's from the x-ray tube, from a radioisotope, from linear accelerator, from any device that we're using. We need to understand if it's producing radiation or x-rays, how to control that production. And then we want to limit the energy deposited in living tissue from any potentially adverse effects, right? So I've got this radioactive ashtray in the classroom with me. right? I'm keeping it a sufficiently far distance from y'all here, and you'll notice only when I get really close to the source did it really start to register significant exposure. So, the people that you're going to be interacting with to do all of those things that I just discussed are physicians, technologists, and therapists. All of us have been educated in the safe operation of radiation-producing equipment. So even the physicians should understand to some degree how the equipment works. They are not necessarily the master of working the equipment, but they have an understanding of how the equipment works. Now, that's not always the case with ordering physicians, though, or nurse practitioners or others. Some of them may have not received very much training on how this stuff works. So you may be required to educate someone who's essentially over your pay grade. That can be a very thorny thing to do. Use protective devices whenever possible, right? Now, there are situations where it's not possible to use the protective devices. In fact, the Association of American Medical Physicists has just released a recent statement saying that patients don't need to be shielded during diagnostic imaging. It's a big deal. It's created a lot of debate. Is that really the case? You know, there's a lot of controversy there. So understand the controversies, understand what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Follow established procedures. So if you're working within a facility, they should have policies that guide the safe use of radiation. Follow them. And then finally, select technical factors that are designed to reduce radiation exposure. Unless you're working in radiation therapy where you just kind of nuke them all. And then the possible benefits related to this is that we can harness the power, the diagnostic power, the therapeutic power of radiation while minimizing potential risks of potential harms. Was there a question? We're good. Okay. All right, so here's a question for us. Occupational and non-occupational doses will remain well below maximum allowable levels when A, referring physicians stop ordering imaging exams. B, technologists, therapists, and physicians keep exposure as low as reasonably achievable. C, orders for imaging procedures are determined only by medical insurance companies. D, patients assume sole responsibility for ordering their imaging procedures. Good, B. And the takeaway terms here are occupational and non-occupational. Occupational refers to us as workers. If you're wearing one of these, you are receiving an occupational dose, right? If you're not wearing one of these, you're receiving a non-occupational dose, right? And then hopefully we're all familiar with the term ALARA. So to be effective in protecting folks from radiation, we need to ensure radiation safety. Now this might seem completely obvious, right? But strangely enough, from my work in the hospital, it was not very obvious. So I would walk into, for example, a surgical department, roll in with a C-arm, start handing out lead aprons, and the nurse would say something like, well, I'm done having babies, right? And it's like, are you also done being cancer-free? So not everyone understands the safety measures that are needed to work around radiation. My job, again, is to educate them on that. So it's ironic to me anytime I hear technologists or folks complaining about the lack of radiation protection in their facility. Because what they're saying is, I'm not doing my job, right? Your job is to keep people radiation safe. That is your job. You're not paid just to sit around and look cool with an awesome machine. That is part of it. But the other part is make sure that people understand the awesome power of this awesome machine. You can use those words. Do you understand the awesome power of this awesome machine? And then we have an obligation to adhere to established radiation protection program. So if the nurse at that point starts ridiculing me for asking her this cancer-free question, I can just say, look, that may be fine for you, but for me, I have to adhere to the radiation protection program. The minute you say radiation protection program, most people just kind of shut down. They're like, oh, what's the program? There's a program? Yes, there's a program. You're supposed to adhere to it, right? It is deeply ironic that people don't. But I think it goes back to the point that I made earlier. This is stuff that we can't see, taste, touch, feel, etc., but it has tremendous power. I'm telling you, it's super powerful, but invisible. All right, so what are those general protection measures we can use? When we talk about radiation protection measures, we're talking about effective measures, things that actually do something. Not like wearing an aluminum hat on your head. That doesn't help, right? Not like running around and screaming and hollering every time you take an x-ray. That doesn't help either. But what are effective things? Things that have research-validated measures to them. Things that are going to safeguard our patients, personnel, and the general public from unnecessary exposure to ionizing radiation. What is unnecessary radiation, right? When is it not necessary? Well, understand that you are the only people that the U.S. government understands and allows to willingly irradiate the U.S. public. No one else can do that. The military can't do it. Nuclear power can't do it. No one can knowingly irradiate the U.S. citizens except for people working in it in medicine. So it is unnecessary if it is not to their benefit. It is unnecessary if it's not to their benefit. If it does not enhance the quality of the imaging procedure or of the treatment. So one question that I have, I worked for a long time, again, as a radiation therapist. We did a lot of portal imaging. We never actually calculated the portal imaging as part of the dose. Right? So portal images they'd be x-ray pictures that we would take with the linear accelerator. So we're using a high dose source to take this picture, but then we're not calculating what the effects of that radiation exposure are in terms of the patient's treatment. So it seemed like a catch-22. These are some of the binds that we have to negotiate. So effective measures are going to take into consideration both the human and environmental determinants, technical elements, which would also include economics, right? What is the most affordable way of doing it? So just about 2 or 3 blocks from here, the University of Tennessee maintains an irradiator. An irradiator is basically a giant redneck hot tub that is inside of what looks like a radiation therapy treatment vault. It has a giant lead door. It has a neutron maze. You go through the neutron maze after turning off the electronic door, and you are encountering this giant redneck hot tub. It's got like moss coming out of it. The water is lukewarm, and deep down at the bottom of this water is a source of californium, right? The reason they have it there and the reason they maintain this is because they can make things radioactive. So for example, I could take this apple, put it next to the californium source, so exit the room, right? Raise the californium source up, have the apple sit by the californium source for a little bit. When I come back into the room, I now have a delicious radioactive apple. It's so radioactive, it makes other things radioactive. That's what an irradiator is. The way that they shield it is the water. The water is the way that they shield it, because water is a tremendously effective barrier for neutrons, right? It stops neutrons cold. And it's also dirt cheap. You can get it anywhere. So when we're thinking about the technique, the technical elements of protecting ourselves, we're also thinking about the economics of it. What are the procedural factors? So I need to understand what are the appropriate procedures to go through when using this stuff, measures that are in place, and one of the kind of keywords here is optimum. So we don't always want to decrease radiation dose to nothing, but we want an optimum amount of dose. We want an appropriate amount of dose. We want to use it to its best. Another word might be quality. So things like time, length, force, and energy that were covered in physics and in radiation physics still apply. All the units of measure that we use with radiation are based off of combining other measures, right? There are 3 unit systems that are in current existence. We are primarily going to use the SI units of measure. So, there is a need to safeguard against significant and continuing radiation exposure, right? And this is based on what we're talking about in terms of the biological effects of this. If we are around it, we need to reduce the amount of time that we're around it. We need to increase the distance that we're from it. And if at all possible, we need to increase shielding as well. The longer that we are around something that's radioactive, the more the biological damage will be there. And there's 2 basic ways that biological damage occurs. It's either a direct somatic damage, that means trauma to the cells. So again, going back to the Chernobyl miniseries, one of the physicists compares it to millions of microscopic bullets, that a radioactive source is producing millions of microscopic bullets. Each one of those bullets is capable of destroying a cell, right? That would be a traumatic damage to the cell. So we're calling that somatic damage. It's determined by how many bullets hit the cell. It's deterministic. The other way we call stochastic, and it basically means we don't fully understand it, so it is kind of random, right? And those are the more long-term effects of radiation, effects within biological systems. But as a general rule of thumb, radiation exposure to the general public should always be kept as low as reasonably possible. That is mandated by the government and reinforced by numerous lawsuits. So if there's ever questions from a patient, from a family member, just let them know I'm required by the government to keep radiation exposure as low as reasonably achievable. That's why I can't allow you in this examination room at this time or in this treatment room at this time or to use the PET CT bathroom at this time. So we need a justification and understand what our responsibility is for every radiation exposure that we make. I've got an image of a mammogram up here because it is one of those things that is sometimes dicey for people to understand what are the benefits, what are the risks of mammography, right? And it is still fairly controversial. So what we're saying is the patient needs to elect to assume a relatively small risk of exposure from ionizing radiation. But when we do a mammogram, right, we're using a fairly low dose, but it's also fairly low energy. And the reason that we're using a low energy dose is because the breast tissue has a very low contrast, right? So we're trying to increase the inherent contrast of the image by decreasing the radiation exposure, the energy of the radiation exposure. This, as a result, increases patient dose, right? There is a point at which if you start to have too many mammograms, you're increasing your risk for breast cancer, right? So we need to understand better what that point is and where the benefit is eclipsed by the risk, right? So not every person and not every female needs to run out and start getting mammograms, right? There's an age at which we'll start having that procedure done. So anytime we're dealing with something that can cause disease or trauma, chances are we need to be using imaging. If we're dealing with cancer, we need to be using radiation therapy. I think that's all I've got on that. Okay. The term for that, and understanding that benefits versus risk that we're considering, in radiation therapy, we call it the therapeutic ratio. In diagnostic imaging, we'll call it diagnostic efficacy, right? What's the diagnostic efficacy? So Therapeutic ratio has to do with how much radiation do we need to give in order to kill all of the cancer cells but spare some of the normal tissue. Kill all of the cancer cells but spare some of the normal tissue. Why? Because normal tissue has the ability to repair itself. Cancer cannot repair itself. Diagnostic efficacy has to do with how much radiation do we need to use to maximize the quality of the images while keeping patient dose relatively low. So optimum image quality at as low as reasonably achievable dose. The same would also be true with giving radiopharmaceuticals. How much do I need to get a good exam without increasing patient's risk? So, who has the responsibility of determining whether or not the exam or the treatment is medically necessary? It is the referring physician. It is not you. It is not me. It is not the therapist. It's the referring physician, right? So it would be the oncologist would be responsible for determining whether or not it is necessary. So nevertheless, that means knowing that they are accepting responsibility, right, for protecting the patient. Ultimate responsibility relies with the referring physician, right? But they are relying on you to help them negotiate that responsibility, right? They are relying on you to help them negotiate that. So it is appropriate at times to talk to the radiologist, to talk to the referring physician, to make sure that you're doing an appropriate exam and that you're taking into account all of the patient's considerations. Now, the technologist and the participating radiologist or the radiation therapist need to share in keeping the patient's medical radiation exposure as low as possible or an optimal dose. And they're going to ensure that both the occupational and non-occupational doses remain below the allowable levels, right? One thing that I would add to this, you'll notice that nowhere in these slides so far have I mentioned education. There's not a lot of research out there about where the responsibility of education exists, where it resides, right? In fact, one of the most recent studies was done by the University of Arkansas, 2004, at a shopping mall. And they just asked people, random strangers at the shopping mall, who is responsible to educate you about getting a chest x-ray and the radiation that's used there. And the majority of people, about 70% of them, answered that they believed the responsibility for educating them on the radiation used in the exam was with the x-ray technologist, right? I would imagine that those results could very easily translate to nuclear medicine, to radiation therapy. This rate, when it comes to understanding what the radiation is doing to their bodies, patients are looking to us. Whether that's appropriate has not yet been determined. That's what I'm saying. There's not an official statement saying who should educate the patient. That's a big freaking omission, right? We've said the responsibility resides with the originating physician, the ordering physician, but they don't have responsibility to educate the patient. That's kind of weird, right?
Isn't that part of the idiot?
Not necessarily. I mean, as we're talking to patients, as we're saying, we're going to be doing an x-ray today, we need to get, you to change into this gown, here I'm going to be placing this lead shield behind you. They may have a question, right, about the process, and so it can be worked into AIDIT, right? But I think that educating patients is a little bit trickier. It's tricky, and I think that's why no one wants to touch it. It's once you kind of ask that question, you kind of opened up Pandora's box. Because the problem is interacting with patients. The second that you as a healthcare worker ask a patient a question, they're going to come back at you with 7 other questions, right? And so we have to figure out a way to script it. So I'm looking to y'all to help me understand better how to script it. I don't have all the answers on this. I just know where the step-off point is. But definitely something like AIDIT, something that's fairly formulaic would be helpful. Okay. So again, we want to use the smallest radiation exposure to produce useful images or produce a useful treatment. We want to avoid repeat examinations, definitely want to avoid repeat treatments. It's kind of obvious why. And there's just an example of an exam that requires a repeat. So ALARA, again, there's a synonymous term, optimized for radiation protection, or ORP. It's not as commonly used. This, by the way, ALARA, has become a legally reinforced concept. It's something that's been asked in the court of law. Do you feel, to an expert witness, do you feel that this technologist practiced ALARA? No, Your Honor, I don't feel that he did. And if that seems like something that can never happen to you, I'll just let you know, over the course of the summer, I have received 2 emails from lawyers asking me to come and testify as an expert witness on cases in Georgia that involve some kind of irresponsible use of radiation. I did not accept it because frankly, I'm not interested in testifying against x-ray techs. It just doesn't strike me as something fun to do, but it can happen. So some cardinal rules that are going to help us maintain ALARA are these 3 basic principles of time, distance, and shielding. These can be applied to both occupational worker and a non-occupational patient. So where does the responsibility for ALARA reside? So this is different from that diagnostic efficacy question. This is asking for this as low as reasonably achievable. Well, there's a number of different ways that we kind of have to break it out. The first is that the hospital has a responsibility. The facility has some responsibility, right? And those responsibilities sometimes can be kind of shocking. Like, for example, after a patient has had certain nuclear medicine exams, they are radioactive, they're peeing out radioactive fluids. The hospital's responsibility is to determine whether it's okay for them to use a regular toilet or not, right? And for the most part, they say, yeah, let them use a regular toilet. Those types of questions they have to ask. Another example of something I heard recently, patient was an end-stage cancer patient. They had a nuclear medicine examination the day before, or maybe it was a brachytherapy. It was a brachytherapy treatment. So they had a prostate seed implant, or something like that. They had a stroke. They died in the hospital. Their body is radioactive, right? The morgue shows up to take the body to prepare it for the funeral. They're wheeling it out the back door, and it trips a radiation alarm as they're wheeling it to the hearse, right? So that was the hospital's responsibility, to have that radiation alarm there at the back door to make sure that no radioactive dead bodies are shipped out of the hospital. Those kinds of crazy things, they happen. If there's a policy, there's a reason why the policy is there. So they need to be able to identify necessary resources, the appropriate environment in which ALARA is to be practiced, and all these written policy statements, right? Our responsibility is to be aware of those policies within the workforce, and then to be aware of how those translate to our equipment, and then finally to perform duties consistent with that. And again, I've said it once, I'll say it again. If someone's not doing their duties consistent with those policies, it is our responsibility to point that out. They are not necessarily thinking about that. They have their eyes on something else. So educating the patient about imaging procedures can help us in terms of getting better pictures. So here's one possible kind of loophole to get education into our domain of responsibility. Because if I explain to a patient why I need them to hold still during a procedure, they're more likely to hold still. So if I educate them, they'll be more compliant. We're going to have a more effective interaction, right? That communication, though, has to be appropriate to the patient's level of understanding, right? So that's one of the most difficult things about this. We're dealing with something that's highly theoretical, it's fairly complex, it does things that are unexpected and novel. How do I explain that to the patient in a way that they can understand? We need to, if we're going to raise these questions, we have to be able to answer the questions that will result, right? So if we tell the patient that, for example, the radiation that they're being exposed to today, and this is true, could potentially lead to the formation of cancer, all of that is true, right? We have to be prepared to answer all of the questions that are going to result from that, right? So finally, we need to be able to inform the patients what needs to be done as a follow-up to their exam. So what are things they can do to improve their body's response or decrease the effects of the radiation, those types of things. When we talk about potential benefits, we need to understand this term risk. Risk, we're going to get down to the weeds with it a little bit, because especially for understanding stochastic effects of radiation or these random things that occur, we need to understand risk. But risk for right now, we'll just understand as the probability of injury, right, or death resulting from an activity. So in this case, what are we talking about for risk? For medical radiation use. The number one risk that we're referring to is the possible creation of cancer or a genetic defect. So there was a study that came out of the UK back in the 1990s. They looked at the use of CT scanning on pregnant females from 1970-something to 1980-something, and they found a possible link between CT scanning and the increased incidence of children who are born with a mental impairment, right? That would be an example of a genetic defect caused by medical imaging, right? Of course, the other one being cancer. Both of those are risks related to radiation use. Once we get into the therapeutic level of radiation use, there's additional actual acute risks, like things like skin burns, epilation, radiation syndromes, and things like that. Anytime we've got a risk like that, there has to be a willingness to accept the risk. In the past, in the model of medicine in the past, that willingness to accept the risk resided with the physician. It was a paternalistic practice, and basically the physician would say, "You're doing this," and you would do it, right? There was no questions asked. That has changed, in part due to the release of that report by the Clinton administration of the radiation tests that were done on U.S. citizens. One of the statements that committee made in the report is that all of these things have increased the need for patient-centered care in regards to radiation. That means that we are responsible for educating the patient. The assumption of risk is now believed to reside with the patient, right? All right, so how then do we communicate to our patients in ways that aren't going to freak them out that we're using ionizing radiation during an exam or a treatment, right? And one of the best ways that I've found goes back to this Geiger counter. Radiation is all around us, right? This Geiger counter, even if I didn't have that radioactive ashtray in this room, it would still be clicking, right? Radiation is part of the natural environment. It's every day of our lives we're being exposed to some amount of radiation. We can use that to calculate what I would call a background equivalent radiation time, or BERT. Background equivalent radiation time. So what I'm saying is, Mr. So-and-so, today we need to do a CT of your head, right? It does involve the use of ionizing radiation. It will allow us to see whether or not you're having a stroke, right? The amount of radiation that we're using to do this procedure is equal to about 2 years of naturally occurring radiation from the Earth's environment, right? So it's equating the radiation dose to natural background radiation. So you can preface statements like that with, radiation is part of the Earth's environment. We are exposed to it. by all sorts of things. So for example, taking a flight to Paris exposes you to roughly the same amount of radiation as what you would get from a single one-view chest x-ray. Right? So there and back from Paris is like a two-view chest x-ray. The problem is a CT would be like 100 trips to Paris. 100 trips to Paris. So giving them ways that they can quantify it and understand it is going to be really helpful, and BERT is one of the most useful ways. As of right now, the most current thing that we have is, I think it comes from 2006, if I remember right, is that the annual U.S. population exposure equals about 3 millisieverts a year from natural background radiation. And it's about 3.2 millisieverts from all artificial sources, medical radiation, industrial radiation, etc. When we use this BERT method appropriately, it does not imply a risk. It doesn't imply risk, which is nice. It's simply a means for comparison. If the patient has further questions about risk, they can ask those on their own. It emphasizes that radiation is part of our environment, which is true. That's not false. That is true. And it gives the patient a metric that they can understand. They may not understand what a millisievert is, but they understand how long a week is, right? All right, finally, standardized dose reporting. One thing that would be really great is if we could get off our collective butts and start reporting dose from all the stuff that we're doing, right? Therapy's been doing it for a long, long time. The rest of us are lagging behind considerably. The problem is it's difficult to standardize that reporting method, right? So for example, different hospitals use different EMRs, different electronic medical record systems. They use different taxes. So if we're going to report dose from an exam or from a treatment, how do we standardize that? Where would it be communicated to? Where would that dose report reside, right? Seems like the most obvious answer is probably the most incorrect answer, but it goes back to what people said after the nuclear bomb. I think the government should handle it, right? What if we just reported it all to NRCP or one of the government regulatory bodies, right? That's a tremendous amount of information to be reporting to them, but that question's yet to be answered. This would be very helpful, though, for us to be able to say over the course of someone's treatment, whether they are getting treatment for kidney stones or for cancer, to say very accurately, this is the amount of radiation that they've received. An example of people that are doing it right is St. Jude. St. Jude tracks radiation dose from all radiation exposures with every patient that they treat. Whether it's a CT scan or a hand x-ray, they are reporting that dose back to a centralized database. So when I did some research in the past, I actually worked with physicists at St. Jude because they had this tremendous data set related to CT exposure. All right, thank y'all so much.